Mr. John Steele Gordon was educated at Millbrook School and Vanderbilt University. His articles have appeared in numerous publications, including Forbes, National Review, Commentary, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. He's a contributing editor at American Heritage, where he wrote the Business of America column for many years, and is currently writing the Longview column. He's the author of several books, including Hamilton's Blessing, The Extraordinary Life and Times of Our National Debt, The Great Game, The Emergence of Wall Street as a World Power, and An Empire of Wealth, The Epic History of American Economic Power. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. John Steele Gordon.
Good evening. I'm very glad to be back at Hillsdale College once again. After all, it's not only a distinguished academic institution, but I've just learned that the federal government doesn't seem to know you exist. Which I think may not be a totally unalloyed blessing. I'm here tonight to talk about money in American history. It's a long history and a distinctly checkered one. And like all good stories, it has a few heroes, such as Alexander Hamilton and J.P. Morgan, and a few villains, especially Thomas Jefferson, whose malignant hatred of commerce and the marketplace in general and banking in particular, transmitted down through the political generations, has visited disaster after disaster on the American monetary system. By the time the United States was founded in 1776, coins had been money for almost 2,500 years. Negotiable banknotes had been in general use for less than a century. But by the last decades of the 18th century, a modern money supply had to have both. And thus we can't talk about the history of American money without talking about the history of American banking. For banknotes put banks in the money business. Banks store money and they loan it, but most importantly, they create it. With banknotes, they created it by printing it. Today, they create money by crediting your account with a given sum or loaning you money on a credit card. Every time you charge something on a credit card, you are, via your bank, borrowing and thus creating money. But because banks are in the money business, that makes banking a very peculiar business indeed. Cash on hand, for instance, is an asset in most enterprises. It is usually a liability for a bank because it is owed to the depositors. Loans, on the other hand, are assets because they are owed to the bank. Further, if an ordinary business goes broke, it is a financial problem for the owners, the employees, and the creditors. But the corporate assets, such as factories, will move to stronger hands and continue to produce. But because banks create money far in excess of their reserves, when a bank goes broke, it can affect the personal economic well-being of nearly everyone in the community, and even, if the bank is large enough, the entire country. That's why banks need very careful supervision. Banks, after all, are owned and run by human beings. And when humans have in their hands the awesome power to create money out of thin air, the temptation to abuse that power and create too much will be given into regularly. Any of you who have ever maxed out a credit card know that temptation. But banks have often not gotten proper supervision over the last 230 years of American history, and as a result, bank failure has been as American as apple pie, at huge cost to the American economy. The first bank failure took place in Rhode Island in 1809, when a fraudulent bank capitalized at $45 issued $800,000 in banknotes, a sum equal to more than 17,000 times the resources behind it. The failure of Lehman Brothers in 2008 marked the beginning of the explosive phase of the so-called Great Recession that lingers on to this day. When the United States achieved its independence from Great Britain in 1783, it lacked a reliable form of money. Britain had forbidden the export of British coins, so while American colonists usually kept their accounts in pounds, shilling, and pence, what circulated in day-to-day transactions was a hodgepodge of Spanish, French, Portuguese, and some British coins, as well as warehouse certificates for tobacco and other products. Since the British had also forbidden the creation of banks, paper money was printed by some colonies until the British government forbade that too. Benjamin Franklin, while printing money for the province of Pennsylvania, came up with several characteristically clever anti-counterfeiting techniques. In New York province and elsewhere, wampum, the form of money used by the Indians, was used in general commerce as well, at least until the 1760s, when a man in New Jersey invented a wampum counterfeiting machine and destroyed the value of the real stuff. Clever, these Americans. Lacking a banking system and a regular money supply, the Continental Congress had no choice but to pay for much of the revolution by issuing fiat money, so-called continentals. Fiat money is money because the government says it is money. Now, if the marketplace disagrees, and it often does, the fiat money will quickly inflate into worthlessness if issued in large quantities. That is what happened to continentals. And the phrase, "not worth a continental," was in the American lexicon for over 100 years. After the Revolution, the need to design and then create a national money system was an urgent task of the new nation. The question of what new unit of account to adopt was a complex one because the inhabitants of the various colonies had used so many different, often incommensurate units. Robert Morris, whose financial legerdemain had done so much to keep the Revolution financially afloat, tried to bridge the difference by finding the lowest common divisor of the monetary units most often encountered in each state. He calculated this to be 1,440th of a Spanish dollar. He proposed that this unit be multiplied by 1,000, which would have made the new American monetary unit equal to 25/36 of a Spanish dollar. Thomas Jefferson, with one of his two good ideas about money, argued instead for just adopting the dollar as the monetary unit. Now, the origin of the word dollar lies in the German word for valley, Tal. In the 15th century, major silver deposits were discovered in what is now the Czech Republic. In 1519, the owner of these mines, the Graf zu Passau und Weißkirchen, began minting coins from this silver, coins which weighed a Saxon ounce, which is slightly less than our ounce. Honest and pure, these coins, called thalers, literally from the valley, had great acceptance in the marketplace and were imitated by other German rulers. In English, thaler soon turned into dollar, just as tal had earlier turned into del and dale. I bet you didn't know that Hillsdale and the dollar are etymologically related. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, whose vast dominions as King of Spain included the new silver mines of Mexico and Peru, began to mint similar coins. Thanks to those silver mines, the Spanish dollar became the dominant international currency of its day. Once the dollar was chosen as the monetary unit, it would have been natural to adopt the clunky British system of dividing the basic unit into 20 smaller units called shillings, and those into 12 still smaller units called pence. But the Spanish dollars in use in the colonies had often been cut into halves, fourths, and eighths, called bits, to make small change, which is why the Spanish dollar was often called pieces of 8, and a quarter is still sometimes referred to as 2 bits. So an octal system of currency would have been a natural idea as well. Jefferson, however, then had his second and last good idea about money, making smaller units decimal fractions of the dollar rather than eighths. Jefferson pushed for coinage of a half dollar, a fifth, a tenth, for which he actually coined the word dime, a 20th and a 100th of a dollar, which he called a cent, a word that had already been coined by Robert Morris. Congress, however, while adopting the cent, 5-cent, dime, and 50-cent coins advocated by Jefferson, decided to authorize a $quarter-dollar coin rather than a 20-cent one. The quarter, of course, is with us yet, now the last distant echo of the old octal monetary system of colonial days, since the New York Stock Exchange stopped trading in eighths of a dollar in 1999. Thomas Jefferson's bright idea for a decimal coinage began to spread around the world, as bright ideas always do. Today, every country on earth has a decimal currency system. Even the British finally adopted one in 1971. Now, of course, at that time, the United States had very little precious metal from which to mint coins, and therefore it minted very few of them. It was a desperate post-revolutionary financial crisis that helped bring about the Constitutional Convention of 1787. And rationalizing the new government's finances was the first order of business when it came into being in 1789. That's why the Department of the Treasury had 40 employees and the Department of State only 5. When Robert Morris turned down the post of Secretary of the Treasury in order to speculate in land, a bad idea, he ended up in debtor's prison, President Washington offered the post to Alexander Hamilton, who was only in his early 30s. Hamilton faced a formidable task, and he accomplished it brilliantly, using a bit of political sausage-making to push his plan through, despite opposition from Jefferson and James Madison. In return for the acceptance of Jefferson and Madison of Hamilton's debt refunding bill, Hamilton agreed to the national capital being moved out of New York City and being established on the Potomac River. In 1789, American bonds had been unmarketable. By 1794, the United States had a good credit rating and its bonds were selling at a premium in Europe. Talleyrand, later the French foreign minister, but then in the United States to escape the terror, explained why. The United States bonds, he said, were, quote, safe and free from reverses. They have been funded in such a sound manner, and the prosperity of this country is growing so rapidly that there can be no doubt of their solvency. By 1801, Europeans held $33 million worth of American securities, and European capital was helping mightily to build the American economy. These sound bonds were an important part of bank reserves, upon which banknotes could be issued, and they were a convenient means of transferring large sums of money. But while Hamilton's plan for the national debt was accepted by Jefferson, Hamilton's idea for a banking system was subjected to intense opposition from Jefferson and his allies. Hamilton wanted to create a central bank, modeled after the Bank of England, to be called the Bank of the United States. The government would hold 20% of the shares, private investors the other 80%. Now, a central bank acts as a depository for government funds and a means of transferring them from one part of the country to another, no small consideration in Hamilton's day. It is also a source of loans to the government and to other banks, and it regulates the money supply, keeping its value steady. Hamilton saw it as an instrument of fiscal efficiency, economic regulation, and sound money creation. Jefferson saw it as another giveaway to the rich, as he expected the bank to be very profitable, and it was. Central banks always are. In 2014, the Federal Reserve made a profit of $98 billion, which went to the Treasury. Jefferson also saw it as a potential instrument of tyranny. Hamilton did not like the idea of the government itself issuing paper money, because he thought that governments could not be trusted to exert self-discipline. Allow governments to print money, thought Hamilton, and they will print it to solve fiscal problems rather than using less politically palatable choices such as raising taxes or cutting spending. Hamilton thought that an independent central bank, with its shareholders' capital at risk, could supply not only a medium of exchange, but the discipline needed to keep the money sound. These banknotes would circulate at par and relieve the desperate shortage of cash. Further, because the central bank could refuse the notes of state banks that got out of line, that act would mean that no one else would take them either. It would supply discipline to the whole banking system. Jefferson argued that because the Constitution does not specifically empower the government to charter a bank, the government could not do so. This doctrine later became known as strict construction. Hamilton argued for a doctrine of implied powers. To convince President Washington to sign the bill, Hamilton wrote an essay explaining and constitutionally justifying his plan. He apparently wrote it in a single night, all 15,000 words of it, and remember that Hamilton wrote with a quill pen, not a computer. In it, he argued that if the government was to deal successfully with its enumerated powers, it must be supreme in deciding how to do so. President Washington, his doubts quieted, signed the bill chartering the Bank of the United States for 20 years. Again, Hamilton's plan for an American banking system worked brilliantly. There were only 3 state banks in 1790. By 1800, there were 29, and by 1811, 250. Bank failure was extremely rare in these years. No wonder Daniel Webster, with typical grandiloquence, would later say of Hamilton that, quote, "the whole country received with delight, and the world saw with admiration. He smote the rock of the national resources, and abundant streams gushed forth. He touched the dead corpse of the public credit, and it sprung to its feet. The fabled birth of Minerva from the brain of Jove was hardly more sudden or more perfect than the financial system of the United States as it burst forth from the conception of Alexander Hamilton." Jefferson did his very best to destroy it. And while Jefferson had lost the battle over establishing the Bank of the United States, he won the war. In 1811, when the charter of the bank came up for renewal, James Madison was president. Unlike Jefferson, who was an ideologue to his fingertips, Madison was capable of learning from real-world experience. And he, having seen how effective the bank had been, now favored renewing the bank's charter. But Madison was constitutionally over-scrupulous and would not use executive pressure to get Congress to renew it. He simply submitted the bill and waited for Congress to decide. When his vice president, George Clinton, broke a tie in the Senate by voting against the bank, probably the only independent political act by a vice president in American history, the bank died. Congress then, having destroyed the government's prime means of borrowing money, soon declared war on Great Britain, the only country on earth capable of attacking the United States. It then adjourned without making any provision to pay for the war. It was probably the most feckless act in the history of the United States Congress, a title for which there is no shortage of candidates. We very nearly lost the war by simply running out of money to pay for it, but managed to escape with a draw. Chastised, Congress chartered a second Bank of the United States in 1816, but it never had the power the first bank had had. Banking discipline began to fray. State banking laws varied greatly. Some had good bank regulatory systems, and some had very poor ones. Some, following Jefferson, kept banks small by forbidding branching. But small banks are inherently weak banks, dependent on local economies. Andrew Jackson, a thoroughgoing Jeffersonian when it came to money and banking, vetoed the renewal of the second bank's charter in 1832. Until 1913, the United States would be the only major country in the world without a central bank. One result was a very high amplitude of in the American business cycle, with bigger booms and bigger busts than other countries. With discipline much loosened by the decline and fall of central banking in the United States, banks and bad banking proliferated, as did bank failure. By 1840, there were 1,000 banks in operation in the United States. 20 years later, the number had nearly doubled. But almost half the banks founded between 1810 and 1820 failed before 1825. A similar percentage of those founded in the 1830s failed before 1845. In the 73 years between the adoption of the Constitution and the outbreak of the Civil War, the money supply multiplied no less than 40 times, from 15 million to 600 million. Only 25% of this money supply, however, was in the form of gold and silver. The rest was in demand deposits and banknotes. With most of these thousands of banks issuing banknotes, knowing which ones were good and which ones were not was a huge problem, even though most only circulated locally. The notes could only be redeemed for specie, gold and silver, at the bank's headquarters, and some banks came to be called wildcat banks, as their headquarters were quite deliberately out among the wildcats and hard to find. Publishers issued what were called banknote detectors to help identify which notes were good, which dubious, and which were known to be fraudulent. It was monetary chaos. But just like the prospect of being hanged in a fortnight, great wars concentrate minds wonderfully. And the American Civil War was the greatest war fought in the Western world in the 100 years between the fall of Napoleon and the outbreak of World War I. The fiscal demands of the Civil War were enormous, with the national debt soaring from 65 million to 2.7 billion. In 1865, the United States government became the first government in history to spend $1 billion in a single year. It wouldn't spend $1 billion again until 1917. The federal government quickly began issuing fiat money, so-called greenbacks, amounting to $450 million by the war's end, about 11% of total federal outlays. While people were forced to accept them in payment of debt, for they were declared legal tender, the government itself would not accept them in payment of taxes, which had to be paid in gold. But while these greenbacks, whose value in gold fluctuated with the fortunes of the Union Army, caused considerable inflation, roughly 75% by the war's end, it was nowhere near as bad as in the Confederacy. With a much smaller ability to raise money through bond issues and taxes, the Confederacy was forced to issue about $1.5 billion in fiat money to pay its bills. Southern states and cities also issued paper money, and because the South had limited facilities for both papermaking and printing, counterfeiters had a field day. Gresham's law that bad money drives out good immediately kicked in, and gold and silver coins disappeared into mattresses as people spent the fiat money. And of course, inflation took off. The South suffered an inflation of about 700% in just the first 2 years of the war. By the war's end, Confederate money had become worthless, and the Southern economy was in shambles. It would take a century to recover. To help finance the war, Congress also finally tackled the chaotic American banking system. In 1863, it established a system of nationally chartered banks. These banks had to have at least $50,000 in capital, a large sum at the time, and had to hold 60% of that capital in United States Treasury securities. National banks were subject to rigorous oversight by the new controller of the currency, by such means as a sudden unannounced audits. These banks were allowed to issue banknotes, but only using a uniform design supplied by the government, and the notes had to be backed 100% by pledged Treasury bonds. The federal government thought that most state banks would take national charters, but they didn't, as many could not meet the capital requirements. By the end of 1863, there were 134 national banks, almost all of them new banks. Changes in the law in 1864 sped conversions, but still most banks remained state chartered. So in March 1865, Congress imposed a 10% tax on the face value of state bank issued banknotes, driving those banks out of the banknote business. It also caused many of them to take national charters. By 1866, there were 1,600 national banks, only about 200 state banks left in existence. There were also, of course, mutual savings banks, private banks, savings and loan associations, and credit unions. None of them issued banknotes, but all acted as banks, taking deposits and making loans. And each type was regulated separately. This multiplicity of bank regulation, unknown in any other country, would be the source of disaster in the 20th century more than once. Because of the Jeffersonian hatred for big banks, national banks were forbidden until 1922 to have branches or operate across state lines. So their number grew quickly as the country's economy and population exploded in size after the Civil War. Meanwhile, state banks discovered that while they could no longer print banknotes, they could still create money by simply crediting a borrower's balance in a checking account. Their number also began to grow quickly. By 1900, there were 3,731 national banks and 4,405 state banks. By 1920, there were about 30,000 banks in the United States, more than all the rest of the world put together. And almost all of them were single unit banks, dependent on the prosperity of just the local community. But at least the era of wildcat banking was at an end. By the end of the Civil War, there were only 3 types of paper money in the country: national banknotes, backed by bank reserves; United States notes, the old greenbacks, redeemable in gold beginning in 1879; and silver certificates that could be redeemed in silver. The country was back on the gold standard. Now, the gold standard simply means that a country establishes the value of its currency in gold and stands ready to buy or sell unlimited quantities of it at that price. In the early 18th century, the value of the British pound had been set at £3, 17 shillings, 10.5 pence per troy ounce of gold. By Sir Isaac Newton, of all people, enjoying the perks of a largely no-show but very well-remunerated job as master of the King's Mint. In 1821, after the Napoleonic Wars, the Bank of England went on the gold standard. Many other major countries followed. The value of the dollar was set at $20.66 per ounce of gold. Now, while the gold standard was popular with the wealthy, especially in the industrialized Northeast, for it effectively makes inflation impossible and facilitates overseas trade, the less affluent hated it. Most Americans in the late 19th century were still farmers, and farmers are chronic debtors. Like all debtors, they liked inflation as it made it possible to pay back their debts in cheaper money. Faced with a strong demand by one influential group, bankers and industrialists, for a gold standard, and an equally strong demand for an inflationary monetary policy by another influential group, farmers, the government, as so often happens in a democracy, tried to have it both ways. For a while, it even worked. While returning to the gold standard, Congress passed the Bland Allison Act in 1878, requiring the Treasury to buy between $2 million and $4 million in silver every month and turn it into coin or silver certificates at the ratio of 16 to 1. In other words, 16 ounces of silver were declared by congressional fiat to be worth 1 ounce of gold. At the time, that was about the market price. But as ever more silver poured out of Western mines, in the 1880s, Nevada and Colorado alone accounted for fully 40% of world silver production. The price declined to about 20 to 1 by 1890. That year, Congress ordered the Treasury to buy 4.5 million ounces of silver a month and turn it into coin or silver certificates at the 16 to 1 ratio, a sure recipe for inflation. With its silver policy greatly increasing the money supply and the gold standard keeping the value of the dollar steady, the government managed, in effect, both to guarantee and to forbid inflation. As anyone who has taken an introductory economics course could predict, Gresham's law kicked in. Silver, worth 1/20th the price of gold in the market, was declared to be worth 1/16th the price of gold when coined as money. So naturally, people began to spend the silver and hoard the gold. And the gold started trickling out of the Treasury. With the major depression that began in 1893, that trickle turned into a flood. Soon the Treasury's gold supply was getting dangerously low, and Congress refused to authorize another bond issue to replenish it. J.P. Morgan, thoroughly alarmed, took the train to Washington to see President Cleveland. But the president refused to see him, knowing that Wall Street, then as now, was the left's favorite whipping boy, and J.P. Morgan was the very embodiment of Wall Street. "I have come down to see the president," Morgan said in his best imperial manner, "and I am going to stay until I see him." With the situation rapidly deteriorating, Cleveland saw him the next morning. Morgan's lawyers had dug up an obscure Civil War-era law allowing the government to issue bonds to buy coin without congressional authorization. Morgan offered that he and August Belmont Jr., who represented the Rothschilds, would buy $100 million in gold coin in Europe and give it to the Treasury in exchange for the new bonds. Further, he promised to keep the market steady and prevent the gold from leaching out of the Treasury once again. He was, in effect, offering to act as a central bank, insulating the Treasury from market forces, and it worked. The next year, the Depression began to lift, but William Jennings Bryan swept to the presidential nomination of the Democratic Party by promising to prevent mankind from being crucified upon a cross of gold. He lost the election badly to William McKinley, whose slogan was "sound money, protection, and prosperity." In 1907, Morgan again acted as a central bank to deal with the financial panic of that year. Even Jefferson's heirs began to realize that a central bank was now a necessity. After all, J.P. Morgan, over 70 at that point, would not be around forever. In 1913, ironically the year that Morgan died, the Federal Reserve System was created. But while Wall Street had wanted a single bank located in New York, after all, that's where the money is, 12 banks were created in cities across the country. Again, the Jeffersonian dread of powerful banks was at work. In a banking panic, member banks could maintain liquidity by borrowing from the Fed, as it is nowadays often called, using their loan portfolios as security. National banks were required to join, and so could state banks that could meet the requirements. But most could not meet them. Thus, the very banks that most needed the ability to borrow from the Federal Reserve in an emergency couldn't do so. As rural areas of the country began to go into recession in the middle of the 1920s, thanks to falling food prices, the banks that served small-town America began to fail. By the late 1920s, these failures were averaging about 500 a year. And when the Great Depression began in 1929, the number of bank failures exploded while the money supply contracted sharply. There were about a one-third deflation between 1929 and 1933, greatly exacerbating the Depression. By the fall of 1932, bank runs where panicked depositors suddenly withdraw their funds fearing failure, and thus making that failure a self-fulfilling prophecy, began to spread from individual banks to the banking system as a whole. By the time Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated on March 4, 1933, state governors had closed banks in 38 states, and the other 10 had limited withdrawals. The American banking system, and thus its money supply, was near death. Roosevelt closed all the banks and gave his first fireside chat, explaining what the government had done and assuring the public that when a bank reopens, it was because the government had found it to be sound, and therefore it was a safer place for one's money than the mattress. The public believed him, and money began to flow once more into banks. It had been a very near-run thing. The Federal Reserve was reorganized, deposit insurance ended bank runs, and Federal Reserve issued banknotes became the dominant form of paper money as national banks stopped issuing them. Gold coins were withdrawn from circulation, and it became illegal to hold the metal in bullion form. The system steadied. In 1951, a man named William Boyle, who worked for the Franklin National Bank in Long Island, invented the credit card, an idea that quickly spread, creating the first new form of money since the banknote. In the 1960s, the price of silver rising, the United States stopped minting silver coins, making some so-called sandwich coins instead. Thus, technically, they were not coins at all, but tokens. Nevertheless, now a trivial portion of the money supply, they continued to be accepted and therefore were money. Gresham's law, however, kicked in as it usually does, and the old silver coins quickly disappeared from circulation. In 1971, President Nixon severed the last link between American money and precious metals when he no longer allowed foreign central banks to redeem dollars for gold. The United States now had nothing but fiat money. So why didn't it inflate into worthlessness as fiat money has so often done in the past? One reason was that most of the money supply was now in the form of demand deposits, not notes or coins. Money had largely become electronic blips in the bowels of vast and interconnected computer systems. The second was that an international currency market had sprung up, trading trillions of dollars in currency a day. If the market thought a country was pursuing unwise monetary policies, it could devalue that country's currency with startling speed. France found that out in 1980 when newly elected President François Mitterrand nationalized the French banking system and tried to move the country toward socialism. The rapidly sinking value of the franc forced him into a hasty retreat. Today, coins are surely on the way to extinction after 2,700 years. It now costs the government 2 cents to mint a penny, most of which end up in coffee cans in bedroom closets. And banknotes are quickly declining as plastic becomes ubiquitous. Even prostitutes, I'm reliably informed, now happily accept plastic in payment for their services. The Internal Revenue Service would, of course, love to eliminate cash altogether to prevent tax cheating. Drug dealers and waiters are less enthusiastic about that. Soon, I'm sure, you won't even have to use plastic. As you make your way through a checkout line, the iPhone in your pocket will sync to the store computer, download a receipt, and you're on your way. It will indeed be a brave new world, one Thomas Jefferson could not have dreamed of and would surely have hated. I doubt Hamilton could have conceived of it either, but I bet he would have loved it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon. We now have time for a few questions. When the microphone comes to you, please stand.
Do you have views about money created by alternatives and getting away from government monopolies, such as maybe Bitcoin?
Well, Bitcoins, to the extent that I understand them, are a sort of electronic version of scrip. And scrip was paper money printed by private organizations and used locally. Often it was companies would pay their workers in scrip, and then the workers would have to buy their goods at the company store. And guess what? Always high prices. So scrip has often been abused, and I'm not quite sure what Bitcoins are yet, and I don't know that economists know either. So we're going to have to wait and see what Bitcoins turn into. But basically, the money supply is now banks, and private organizations can't regulate banks. Only the government can regulate banks. Unfortunately, they often do it very badly.
I had a question and I can't remember it.
What do you think about what Mr. Bernanke has done over the last few years with regard to the American debt and to the absorption of it by the Fed?
Well, he's riding the back of a tiger. I mean, at some point, those has got to get off the Fed's balance sheet, and that's going to be very tricky to do. I hope that Janet Yellen will this month begin to raise interest rates a bit, but then, if interest rates go back to normal, the service on the debt is going to go through the roof, and that's going to crowd out other federal spending, or they'll raise taxes, or they'll borrow the money to pay the interest on the debt, which is a really lousy idea. So I'm not a great fan of Ben Bernanke. He was in a very difficult position the whole time. First thing I wish he had done was not let Lehman Brothers go broke. I think he said he didn't have the authority, do it and find out the authority later. Franklin Roosevelt closed all the banks in 1933 on the authority of the Trading with the Enemy Act from 1917. And, a week later they passed legislation to thoroughly authorize him to do it. Sometimes you have to act quickly and clean the mess up later. And I think that it was a terrible mistake to let Lehman Brothers go down. Not that Lehman Brothers didn't deserve a severe whipping, because they certainly did.
As you mentioned, we are turning from using cash to solely cards and even iPhones. What are your views on Americans being the leaders in overspending and relying on credit to live?
I'm sorry, I can hear you, but I can't quite understand you.
As you mentioned, we are turning from using cash to solely cards and even iPhones. What are your views on Americans being the leaders in overspending and relying on credit to live?
Well, overspending almost by definition is a bad idea. Sometimes you have to do it. We certainly, many times we overspent. Hamilton said that a national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. And it certainly has been a national blessing many times. We used it to save the Union in the 1860s. We used it to save the American economy in the 1930s. We used it to save the world in the 1940s. But in 1970, the national debt was around $300 billion, which was about 39% of GDP. Today, 45 years later, it's 104% of GDP and $18.5 trillion. And why? Since 1970, we have had no great wars remotely resembling World War II. We have had no Great Depression remotely resembling the 1930s. And we've had decades of enormous prosperity in the 80s and 90s and the early part of the 2000s. So why did we run up this enormous debt? The reason is so that nobody in Washington, D.C. ever had to say no to anybody. And what we are doing is we are stealing this money from our grandchildren so that we can live better today. Because today's debt is tomorrow's taxes. There's no escape from that. And so it is American democracy at its absolute worst.
What do you think about going back to the gold standard?
We can't go back to the 19th century gold standard because there simply isn't enough gold. There's very little, gold is very, very rare stuff. All the gold ever mined in the world would make a cube about 21 feet on a side. It would easily fit in this room. It would be pretty heavy. And so the gold standard is too inflexible. I think that Steve Forbes's idea of using gold as a proxy for other values is a good one, that the Federal Reserve should try to keep the price of gold steady rather than just ignore it like they do now. We can't go back to the literal gold standard where you could literally, if you go into the Treasury building from Pennsylvania Avenue, the first room you come to is called the cash room. And used to be you could take silver certificates or gold-backed dollar bills, as they were called. They were backed by gold. You could take that into the cash room and they would give you the medal for it. The old silver certificates would say, this certifies that there is on-demand certified in the Treasury of the United States, $1 in silver, payable to bearer on demand. And literally true, it was a minor tourist event to go into the Treasury and say, give them a silver certificate, and they would solemnly hand you a silver dollar. That's just not possible anymore. So to go back to the classic gold standard is well, it wouldn't work. I mean, it's a nice idea in theory, I suppose, but not unless somebody discovers a really big gold mine. And that's highly unlikely at this point.
There are a number of people, somewhat influential and learned, that believe that no way can the United States tax itself out of the large debt that we have. However, the International Monetary Fund has recommended that the United States exercises a bail-in. Would you have any comments and perhaps explain to some of the folks what a bail-in is?
I'm not quite sure what a bailee is. I mean, it's somebody who's put up your bail.
A bail-in was done in Cyprus, it was done in Hungary, and it's recommended by the International Monetary Fund to the only thing that can save our debt. And what a bail-in is that the banks have the authority through the government, the United States government, to, particularly over a weekend, go in and reduce every American's financial accounts, brokerage or banks, by a percentage, like say 10%. So that money goes to reduce the debt, and everybody wakes up on Monday morning with lower national debt but lower assets.
If you want to start a rebellion in this country again, I'd just try that one. I think that, in 1945, the national debt was 130% of GDP. In 1970, it was 39% of GDP. Now, how did we do that? Well, very simple. We didn't borrow more money, or very little money, like $16 billion over those 25 years. And the American economy grew enormously in those 25 years. We can do the same that we did in the 1990s, when the debt as a percentage of GDP went down and down and down for those, after the Republicans took control of Congress in 1994. If we just stop borrowing money, tell somebody, no, sorry, we can't afford it. And then the American economy would grow us out of the debt. We're never going to pay back the debt. We did once in 1835. Only major country in the world ever to pay off its national debt. Didn't last long because we went into deep depression in 1837. But no, I mean, going into everybody's bank balance and helping themselves at 10%, and it would not be pretty on Monday morning, I promise you.
Thank you very much. So obviously, an interesting facet of money in American history is government-aided, government-funded education. So I guess my question is, what is your opinion on government supplying aid to students seeking higher education?
Well, the first thing is that if you have a commodity that keeps rising in price over and above inflation for year after year, and there is no constraint on supply, you have a cartel in operation. And that is what higher education in this country is. It is a cartel. And the cartel mechanism is the accrediting organizations. And the government student loans and stuff simply exacerbate that problem. I mean, they help students go to school, and the schools immediately raise their prices to absorb that new money. What they need to do is compete, and we need to thoroughly reform the accrediting organizations, because they are at the heart of this beast. When I graduated from Vanderbilt, it was $1,100 a semester, $2,200 a year. Take out the inflation, that's roughly $15,000. Tuition and fees today at Vanderbilt are $60,000. In other words, it costs 4 times as much as it cost me to go to that school. Are they really getting 4 times as good an education? I kind of doubt it. They have much better dorms, and they have wonderful facilities and all that sort of stuff. But they're not getting a better basic education. They're just paying a lot more for it.
The Fed has put this interest rate hike on hold for a few months now. When do you think action will take place, and how do you think the market will react to it?
Well, an awful lot of people now think it's going to happen in the December meeting of the Open Market Committee, and I suspect it will happen. The Fed never likes to do anything it doesn't have to do, because whatever they do, they're going to get yelled at, and so it's easier to do nothing. But I said at some point we're going to have to begin to reduce that stuff on the balance sheet and raise interest rates back up to normal. And I hope they start doing it sooner rather than later. The market went down 180 points today because people think they're going to raise it in December, but 180 points is no big deal today. So I hope she starts in December, but we will see. I thought she was going to do it in November, but or actually in October. I thought she was going to do it, but I was wrong as usual.
Thank you for your speech. Dr. Calvert, in the first lecture in the CCA, had said at the end of his lecture that we will never live in a cashless society because humans have a particular affinity to a physical exchange of goods. How would you respond to that statement?
Well, I talked to Dr. Calvert about it, actually, and we just have a disagreement about the future. The nice thing about disagreements about the future is neither of us is wrong, at least for now. And so I just can't imagine we're going to have coins jingling in our pocket for much longer. I think banknotes will last for a lot longer because of various reasons. Drug deals and things like that. If you really want to break the heart of Russian oligarchs, change the $100 bill and declare the old ones not good delivery anymore. But I can't see that in 100 years, when we're flying around in our personal jets and what have you, that we're still going to be using dollar bills. But we will see, or you will see. I probably won't.
Excuse me, sir. I apologize if I'm misinformed, but at the beginning of the school year, I heard an awful lot about China starting to create a new system of money that they hoped would become the main source of exchange internationally. If you know anything about that, do you know if that poses any threat to the American dollar at all?
I don't think so in the short term. For one thing, there's no economy on the world big enough other than the United States to really act as the reserve currency. There are other reserve currencies, but the dollar is the one that counts. And the yuan or the renminbi. I never have figured out why they have two different names. At the moment, people don't trust China, and for very good reason. And why would anybody keep the currency of China as a reserve currency when China could act tomorrow to change its value? So I just think it's going to be a long time before that happens. China would love to have that happen. But China has got really big problems that we don't hear much about because it's so hard to report in China, and their statistics aren't worth much because underlings tend to tell the big guys what they want to hear, so they don't find themselves, cleaning latrines in Xinjiang. So I think, China in the next 25 years is going to be a source of really big news, and a lot of it's going to be unpleasant. But again, we will see.
If the interest rate were to be set by market conditions today, at what rate do you see that percentage being?
Oh, well, I'm not about to predict interest rate. Wall Street tries it all the time and doesn't do a very good job of it. So I have no idea what the market would set in a purely free market, what the interest rates would be. I have no way of knowing that. I wish I did. I could make a lot of money.
I don't mean to ask an inappropriate question, but if you can comment, what do you think of Mr. Trump's economic comments or positions or theories? Do you have anything you'd care to say?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Do you have any comment that you would care to make about Donald Trump's economic pronouncements?
Well, Donald Trump is a very entertaining man. God save us from winning the White House. I mean, as I said at dinner, I said, I just really cannot conceive that having a president who colors his hair being male. And so, I mean, I'll leave it at that. I mean, Donald Trump is having a very good time, but he's a distraction, and I suspect because he has an awful tendency to shoot his mouth off. And I think one of these days he's going to say something that he can't take back, and people will not forgive. And then he'll just fade like a popped balloon. I sincerely hope that's the case.
Hello. First, let me thank you for speaking tonight. It was very illuminating for someone like me who has always been had a close affinity towards Thomas Jefferson. First, let me say that you brought on your speech originally talking about fiat currency being instilled within the revolutionary era and how that was a positive aspect. And then later on, went on to say about how the fiat currency that was used during the Civil War from the South was disparaging. And I would just be very curious to see how those two interplay within your mind. Thank you.
Well, in both cases, with the Continentals in the American Revolution and the fiat money in the South in the Civil War, they had no alternative. It was that or lose the war, and again, we'll figure out the consequences later. Most Confederate money said that it would be redeemed in gold 2 years after the signing of peace between the United States and the Confederacy. Fiat money is never a good idea, at least back in those days, it was never a good idea. But if it's the only means of staying alive, there was a New York real estate man named William Zeckendorf who died in 1976. And Manhattan real estate is a game of very high stakes. And he made a great deal of money at it. But he was famous for borrowing at high rates. And somebody asked him why, and he said, because it's better to be alive at 20% than dead at the prime rate. He died in 1976. In 1980, the prime rate actually hit 20%. So, necessity makes us do things we have to do. And so that's, we borrowed money, we printed the stuff in the 1770s, and the Confederacy printed it in the 1860s.
We have time for one more question.
This is in the same vein. I came to America in 1968. I went to the ground round in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, to have my first Manhattan, 75 cents. I put $7.50 in a drawer and I said, once a rainy day comes and I feel down, I will have 10 Manhattans. Last year that happened. I went to the same place, put my $7.50 on the bar, and I got 1 Manhattan. Who in heaven's name drank the other 9?
Well, I don't know. I can tell you a story of my grandfather who was, he went to Wall Street in 1898 as a runner, which is messenger boy, and he was paid $5 a week. And he would, for lunch, he would go into a bar and he would buy a beer for a nickel. And he'd never liked beer, and so he would give the beer to the thirstiest person he could see, but that nickel entitled him to the free lunch. So prices have changed a bit. He was a roommate with Douglas Fairbanks, who later became the famous movie actor. And I actually have a letter from Douglas Fairbanks asking my grandfather to be patient about that $10 loan. I don't know if he ever did pay it back.
Thank you
very much.